Okay, so we now turn to the Finance Prize. So I'll invite Marco Boscolo up here to give out the prize with me. So I stand in here for Mike Burkhardt, who's a professor of finance at the London School of Economics, who edits the series. Now, Mike is a theorist, like Matthias de Vatripont, so applied theory. They apply theory to interesting subjects. So Matthias talked about his application of theory yesterday to the question of banking. So in this case, Mike has chosen a paper about ESG, and it is the paper ESG, a Panacea for Market Power, and the prize winner, one of the two, is here, Philip Bond, and with his co-author Doron Levit, they have won this paper. Now, why did Mike and his editorial team choose this paper? Well, ESG obviously is a hot topic, but this paper doesn't just focus on ESG, it focuses in on the S. So that's really special about it, and they do this in a very rigorous way because they use theory to analyze this, and they also look at competition. There are trade-offs involved here, so it's not easy to do. So this is really an outstanding example how you can bring rigorous analysis to this important topic of ESG, and in particular the S. That's why the editors have chosen the paper. Now, the prize is going to be handed out by Marco Boscolo from Intesa Sanpaolo, and he's going to say a few words about Intesa, what they think about the prize, Intesa's support for ECGI, and then we'll invite Philip up in person to talk about his paper. And unlike Curtis, you can then actually ask him some questions. Okay, Marco, I hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. So, thank you, everyone, and congratulations to Professor Bond for this prize. Of course, I'll be brief because I don't want neither to spoil the content of the paper and neither want to bore you too much because we are here to listen to the research, actually, to the paper. So I'm really honored to be here to award Professor Philip Bond for his paper, winner of the Intesa Sanpaolo Finance Prize. Intesa Sanpaolo is delighted to serve as the finance series sponsor for the third consecutive year. This is reflecting our long-lasting relationship with the ECGI, which started in 2008, and we hope that will long last in the future years also. And we support, of course, the mission and the vision of improving corporate governance practices. Of course, there should be no need to explain why sustainable corporate governance really matters for a large banking institution such as Intesa Sanpaolo, and of course there is no need to explain to you that are practice. But a good sustainable management structure and transparent practices are crucial for the banking industry for two very good reasons, in my opinion. The first one is that the sustainable governance improves risk management, and the second one is that enhances trust and accountability towards stakeholders and shareholders. Sustainable governance improves risk management by identifying potential environmental liabilities linked to lending and investment activities, promotes informed decision-making, and strengthens financial stability, while also meeting the expectation of socially conscious clients that are growing in these years, luckily, I would say. Moreover, effective sustainable governance encourages ethical behavior and transparency by providing clear information about environmental impacts and governance practices. This builds trust and accountability with all stakeholders, attracts new investment opportunities, and increases the institution's reputation by demonstrating a genuine commitment to sustainable practices. Indeed, it is essential to be aware of the impact that our group has or may have on the social environment and institutional context in which it operates, through a commitment to generate long-term collective value with the aim of responding to requests of our customers, investors, and other stakeholders, and employees as well, who consider ESG aspects increasingly vital components of their decision-making processes. The importance of the matter is visible also from the multiplicity of actors within the group that are involved in the ESG governance system, from the board of directors to the bodies and structures that support the assessment and in-depth analysis processes related to ESG issues. Just a few data from the sustainability statement of 2023, which is it has been published in March 2024. That are worth to be mentioned to concretely demonstrate the commitment of the bank to ESG in its governance. 60% of the meetings of the board of directors dealt with ESG topics. 13 meetings of the Risk and Sustainability Committee specifically concerned ESG issues. More than half of the meeting of the steering committee were dedicated to ESG themes, and the ESG control room met 11 times during the last year. So the sustainable governance is also strengthened by the setting up of a sustainability manager retained by the ESG control room, identified in each area and division. Furthermore, what I would like to add also is that earlier this year, Intesa Sanpaolo has created a new governance structure focused on sustainability, the Chief Sustainability Officer, so we are happy and proud of it. And that is responsible for all the sustainability strategy, planning and monitoring for the whole group. So connecting the approach of Intesa Sanpaolo to the topics addressed by the paper written by Professor Bond and Professor Levit, and using the author's expression, the bank will certainly fall under the category of a purposeful firm. Namely those firms that under a stakeholder capitalism paradigm adopt ESG policies that are aimed at maximizing the total surplus created by the firm and not merely the firm's profits. So I don't want to add anything more, and I will let the floor to Professor Bond and congratulate him for the prize. Thank you. Is here. Please. It's a better perspective. Please. Oh.
So, where did you want to select?
Here? Thanks to you.
Just keep track of the time. Okay, great. Okay, well, it's a great honor to, first to have received this prize, and big thanks to Intesa Sanpaolo for their sponsorship of it. Let me tell you a little bit on behalf of Doron and I what we're trying to do in this paper. I think you'll see this actually is really quite connected with many things that came up yesterday, so I'll try to give you some sense of this. So I thought Elaine was whispering something at me. As Marco alluded to, this is what we'd call in economics a theory paper. So this is largely a conceptual exploration of the topic. I actually wanted to call, I agree with Doron on basically everything in the paper other than the title. So I always wanted to call this the basic economics of ESG because I think that actually gives a better sense of what we're doing, but Doron won the title fight. So, okay. So what are we doing? So we're asking a question which we think is actually sort of very basic, but which somehow has not been that examined. And the question is this: so increasingly we see firms making a variety of promises to treat their stakeholders better than market conditions alone dictate. Okay, so these are all the things that you're all very familiar with. This is promising to pay your workers more than market wages would be, to treat them better in various other dimensions, to give them nice benefits, to have a nice work culture. In the other domains, this would be promising to charge reasonable prices for your products. In the product space, this more usually takes the form of delivering a high quality to price ratio. So that would be things like delivering a safe product, delivering a product with ample privacy features, with ample and with sort of attractive environmental features. In pharmaceuticals, it is often directly just, I'm not going to charge you too much for the pharmaceutical product. And then finally, in the more general supply space, particularly for raw ingredients, this would be promising to sort of pay my suppliers, say of chocolate or coffee, are two big examples of this, a reasonable price for their inputs. Okay, so these are all things that I'm sure you're extremely familiar with. And so the question we want to ask in this paper is simply, suppose that firms make these sort of promises, what do we expect the market outcome to be? Okay, so that's really it. As Marco alluded to, this would fall primarily under the S piece of ESG, although there is some small overlap with the other legs. Okay, so this is the question we're after in this paper, and so what do we say? So before I go any further, I actually just have to pause and give a little bit of background on market conditions, right? So I said we're going to think about firms paying their workers more than market conditions dictate, charging consumers less than market conditions dictate, at least in a quality-adjusted sense. So, you know, what's the market conditions in that phrase? So one of the things we do in this paper is we take seriously the idea that markets start not in the competitive ideal that we spend so much time thinking about in economics, but in a state where firms enjoy some market power. Okay, so again, market power is something that sort of it rolls easily off the tongue, but there's going to be a feature of this that I do want to just pause and emphasize. So when we think about market power, we think about, in labor markets, we think about this as firms exercising monopoly power and paying their workers less than they need to, or less than the market ideal. And in the product space, this would be firms exercising some degree of monopoly or oligopoly power and charging higher prices than they otherwise would do so. But the point I want to emphasize on this, because it's going to come up repeatedly, is that the way firms do this, and we can sort of say it either way, we can either say by charging higher prices they sell less, or we can say they sell less in order to charge higher prices. But an important part of exercising market power is that output is reduced. Right? The higher prices and lower wages come hand in hand with having lower output. And you'll see very shortly why I'm just pausing to remind you of that very basic feature. Right? To be clear, it's obviously not new to our paper, but it is worth highlighting that market power is fundamentally about reducing output at the same time as you're moving prices in the firm's favor. Okay. So let me now start to say a little bit about what we do in the paper. So we're going to think about a firm making what we call an ESG pledge. So an ESG pledge here, or an ESG pledge or promise, is again this pledge or promise to pay workers more than market conditions dictate, or to charge prices lower than market conditions dictate. So what does this do? So it's going to have two offsetting effects, and a lot of what we do in the paper is sort of work through which of these two offsetting effects is the relevant one. So the first offsetting effect, and this is perhaps the more obvious one, is that if the firm has promised, I'll start to say this from the worker case, but I emphasize that everything I say for workers has a dual statement that applies to customers. So if a firm has promised to pay its workers more than market conditions dictate, one effect of that is that when the firm actually comes to hire the workers, it will look at the workers and say they're very expensive. And because of this, the firm will tend to hire fewer of them. So this is going to be higher wages, but for a smaller number of workers. Okay. So what does that mean? It means that the firm is going to end up producing less. So remember, I already mentioned this, we're starting with the possibility that there's some market power. So firms have already reduced their output relative to some market ideal, and this is going to be, the firm is going to be now producing even less, because when it comes to time to hire the workers, it's going to say these guys are expensive, I'm going to hire fewer of them. Okay, so that's the first effect. The second effect, which as I've already hinted at, is going to go in the opposite direction. So this is going to be a slightly more of a mouthful to say. So this goes back to thinking about how firms exercise market power. So when a firm is exercising market power, so again, I'll say this from the wage perspective. So when a firm is exercising monopsony power, remember what it's doing. It's hiring fewer workers, because by hiring fewer workers, it's driving down the wage. Okay? But if a firm has made this ESG pledge, then it no longer has the incentive to hire fewer workers. The whole point of hiring fewer workers to exercise market power is because I'm driving down the wage. But once I've promised to pay my workers, say 20 euros an hour, then that incentive is now gone. Now I have no incentive to try to hire less. And so, other things equal, this is going to be, the ESG pledge is going to push me in the other direction. Now the ESG firm is actually going to hire more. Why is it going to hire more? Again, because this was a firm that was exercising some degree of monopsony power before. Now the monopsony power is still there, but the pledge stops it exercising monopsony power, and it will respond to that by hiring more. Okay, so for those of you who have followed the minimum wage literature, this effect is sometimes mentioned in the minimum wage literature. Okay, so we have these two effects. We're going to call these, and the labeling is perhaps not as obvious as it might be. We're going to call these two effects the anti-competitive effect and the pro-competitive effect. And to be clear, the labels here come from how this is going to affect other firms in the market, right? So the anti-competitive effect is because the ESG firm is getting smaller, and so it's a less fierce competitor to its competitors. And the pro-competitive effect is the firm is getting larger, and hence is a stronger competitor to its competitors. Okay, so that's where the labels come from. Okay, so having highlighted the two ways in which these ESG pledges can potentially have an effect on the adopting firm, let me now start to say what these pledges do both to the firm's own stakeholders and to various stakeholders and shareholders at competitors. Okay, so we're going to start with what we'll call a moderate ESG pledge. So this is an ESG pledge that is, I'm promising to pay my workers more than market conditions dictate, but not that much more, right? If the prevailing wage rate is, say, 18 euros, now I'm going to pay 20 euros an hour, 25 euros an hour, whatever. But it's going to be a relatively small departure from the prevailing market condition. So for moderate ESG policies, the dominant effect is the pro-competitive one that I went through on the previous slide. This is the committing to ignore monopsony power, the committing to ignore monopoly power. And so the effect of the ESG pledge is actually that the ESG firm, and again, this is perhaps, we did not sort of see this coming when we sat down to write this paper, the effect of the ESG pledge is to commit the firm to compete harder than it otherwise would, right? This is the ESG pledge, committing the firm not to act so much like an oligopolist or a monopsonist. And so the ESG firm effectively commits harder. And in this case, basically, lots of good stuff happens, right? So this means the firm itself gets bigger, the firm's market share goes up, the firm's profits go up, the firm's own stakeholders are better off by design, right? The firm now employs actually more workers and pays them more, delivers more product and gives a better deal to customers. Competitors do suffer, right? So competitor output goes down, competitors' market share goes down, competitors' profits go down. But the stakeholders at competitors also benefit from the ESG firm's pledge, because the competitors, even at the same time they lose market share, they do have to move their own wages and their own prices to match those of the ESG firm. So this is the case in which an ESG firm adopts this, say, pro-worker policy, but is also going to have a positive effect for workers at other firms. There's going to be some redistribution of workers across the industry, so we're going to have more workers at the ESG firm, fewer workers elsewhere, but total employment in the industry is going to go up, or again, said from the product market's perspective, total output in the industry is going to go up. And one final point worth emphasizing here is that because the competing firms, the non-ESG firms, actually end up responding to the ESG firms' policies, in equilibrium, you actually won't, if the only information you had, if you were the proverbial Martian and the only information you had was seeing what wages firms offer, you actually wouldn't be able to tell which the ESG firm was, right? Because in equilibrium, they're all going to be paying the same wages or charging the same prices. But the changes in the marketplace are all the direct consequences of the policies adopted by the ESG firm. Okay, so this is the benign case of moderate ESG policies. Aggressive ESG policies, so again, if we're thinking about the wage example, this is if the prevailing wage rate is 18 euros, but suddenly I say I'm going to pay my workers 100 euros, then basically everything on the last slide is the other way around. Okay, so this is the much less benign outcome. This is the case in which the ESG firm has now pledged to pay its workers so much, it's turned itself into a very weak competitor. Because of this, it is going to produce much less. It's going to look at its workers and say they're way too expensive to hire, or in the product market space, it's going to say, I'm charging my customers so little, it's not worth serving them. So this firm gets smaller, it loses market share, it produces less, its profits go down. Competitors benefit. Again, this is the anti-competitive effect of ESG. So, like any sort of other policy in this world, the competitors are going to like that the ESG firm is now a less aggressive competitor. So, competitor output goes up, competitor market share goes up, competitor profits go up. The effect on the industry is going to be bad, and the effect on stakeholders at other firms is also going to be bad. The ESG firm is now a less fierce competitor. And so, I'll say this in the worker context, the ESG firm is going to employ fewer people. The people who still are employed are going to be better off, right? The ESG firm has promised to treat them well. There aren't going to be so many of them, but the remaining employees are going to be better off. But the employees at other firms are going to be worse off. This is going to be sort of a negative externality of the ESG policy. Why? Because again, the ESG firm is now a less fierce competitor, so the labor market is less competitive, and workers at other firms are going to suffer. And again, there's going to be a dual implication for the product market. So that's what I've just said. The ESG firm stakeholders benefit, but those that competitors are hurt. Okay, so where are we? So far, what I've done is to go through now the sort of, if the ESG policy sort of is random or firms just don't know what they're doing and they're stumbling around in the dark. What I've analyzed so far is what we expect the market outcome to be. Okay, for the remainder of my time, I now want to think about a firm which has more idea what it's doing and is picking ESG policies with some objective in mind. Okay, so we'll think first of the traditional assumption that the firm is a profit-maximizing firm, and its aim in picking ESG policies is to increase its profits. So, as we just covered on the previous two slides, perhaps surprisingly, and again, this is something we certainly hadn't realized when we started writing this paper, a firm will benefit from moderate ESG policies, right? Remember 2 slides back, I showed you that a moderate ESG policy raises the profits of the adopting firm. Again, why? Because it's committing itself to be a more fierce competitor. Okay. So we'd expect a profit-maximizing firm to adopt a moderate ESG policy. Exactly how moderate is it going to be? Well, the ESG policy is going to be more moderate the more competitive the market is. Because remember what's going on here, the ESG policy, the profit-maximizing firm is adopting the ESG policy to commit to compete harder. The closer the market is to the competitive ideal, the less valuable that effect is. And so the more competitive the market is, the less we expect to see profit-motivated ESG policies. Okay? So far, I've been acting like only one firm gets to adopt an ESG policy. And maybe at the start of the cycle, that's true. At some point, obviously, you should think about many firms adopting ESG policies. And when many firms adopt ESG policies, now firms are competing not just in labor and product markets, but also in this sort of pre-game of the ESG policies they adopt. So what happens when firms compete in ESG policies? So I've sort of already shown you so far that, if your competitors don't adopt an ESG policy, and I do adopt a moderate ESG policy, then my profits go up. So that statement is true more generally. It doesn't have to be the other guys don't adopt any ESG policy. It's always going to be the case, or almost always going to be the case, that adopting a more aggressive ESG policy than my competitors gives me some competitive example, okay? Competitive advantage. So a firm is always going to be able to somewhat raise its profits by outdoing the competitors' ESG policies. Okay? But if you pause and think about it, that's true, but there's also something a little bit weird about the statement, because you should pause and think, well, what if we've all adopted very, very aggressive ESG policies? Then surely in that case, it is true that I would do a little better by outdoing my competitors' aggressive ESG policies, but I would do better still by doing something dramatically different, which is just give up on ESG altogether. So if all my competitors are adopting very aggressive ESG, they're all promising to pay their workers 50 euros an hour, then it is true that I would increase my profits if I'm the high ESG firm, if I'm offering 51 euros an hour, but I would do even better if I just said, enough of these ESG policies, I'm just going to pay my workers what market conditions dictate. So something we sort of hint at in the paper, but have not formally pursued, is that if you put these together, you can see that these forces are going to generate an ESG cycle. So we're going to have a phase where firms compete up, offering workers, in this case, slightly more than their competitors. So we're going to compete up over time. But at some point, we'll have competed up to a level where the profitable deviation is going to be to stop this upward cycle of competition and instead say we're going to abandon ESG. And at least when Doron and I sort of squint at corporate history, especially in the US, we think this sort of fits with sort of relatively pro-social policies from the 1960s, shifting to much less pro-social policies of the 1980s, shifting to a more recent cycle in which firms have been again competing in relatively pro-social policies. To finish up, and our generous sponsor alluded to this, I want to finish up by thinking about a firm that is not just interested in maximizing profits, but a firm that is trying to maximize the sort of combined surplus it's delivering to its shareholders, its workers, its customers, and any other stakeholders altogether. Okay? So in the paper, we call this sort of firm a purposeful firm. But again, what you want to think here is a firm that is directly interested in the welfare, not just of its shareholders, but of its workers and customers also. So in general, you want to think about a firm like this as wanting to be big. Right? A firm like this, because it's interested in maximizing the surplus of its combined stakeholders, in general, it focuses on all the surplus it's creating, again, not just for its shareholders, but also when I'm employing someone, I'm generating surplus for my employee. When I'm selling someone a good, I'm generating surplus for the person I'm selling it to. And so the firm focuses on all this surplus, and because it's focusing on all this surplus, it wants to be bigger. By expanding, it's going to create even more surplus. So the aim of this firm is basically to be as big as possible. So how does it become big in a world in which it is still competing against other firms? To become big, it adopts an ESG policy. Right? Again, if you think back to those earlier slides, a moderate ESG policy makes me bigger. But also remember that at some point, the ESG policy got so aggressive that it started to make the firm smaller. So the purposeful firm adopts the most aggressive ESG policy that is still in the pro-competitive region. Right? So the purposeful firm adopts the most aggressive ESG policy that does not tip in to the anti-competitive region and start making it smaller. Okay? So that's what a purposeful firm does. So the purposeful firm, so far this all sounds great, but I should also point out that what's going on here is the purposeful firm is capturing market share at competitors' expense, which arguably is not an issue. But in the end, there is also some social cost here. Because the purposeful firm is getting large at its competitors' expense, there's some distortion in productive efficiency. The ESG firm gets bigger, the non-ESG firms get smaller, and in any world in which there's some diminishing returns kicking in, that shift of size is distortive, and so there is some social cost to this reallocation of production away from the non-ESG firms to the ESG firms. Okay, so I think this is the last slide of any substance. So I've just discussed what a purposeful ESG firm does when it's the only ESG firm in the marketplace. What I want to finish up with is thinking about the case in which there are multiple competing purposeful ESG firms. So these are, again, multiple firms are picking ESG policy, and they're all doing it now not with the objective of maximizing profits, but instead with the objective of maximizing some combination of profits and stakeholder value. So what happens here? So some things are exactly like the profit maximizing case. It remains the case that the purposeful firms, they want to be large. How do they get large? They adopt ESG policies, and they adopt ESG policies that are more aggressive than those of their competitors. So there's still going to be this sort of upwards pressure to outdo your competitors' ESG policies. So that's the same as competition in ESG policies between traditional shareholder value-focused firms. The thing which is different is that the profit-maximizing shareholder firms eventually get to a point where they look at the world and they say, I'm promising my workers so much that it would be better just to abandon ESG altogether. Why? Because directly I just get to pay my workers much less, and that's going to be good for profits. But the firm that's picking ESG not just with its profits in mind, but also thinking about its shareholders' welfare, is obviously not going to put so much weight on the direct benefit of cutting its workers' salary. That's not a win for the firm that's interested in its shareholders' value. And so the purposeful firm is just going to continue keep competing up. It's not going to face this temptation to adopt this much more dramatic deviation and abandon ESG altogether. So what does that mean? It means that ESG firms, when they're looking to maximize sort of overall surplus, overall stakeholder surplus, are just going to compete up and up, and this is only going to stop when they've competed wages all the way up to the competitive ideal or prices all the way down to the competitive ideal. And in fact, ideally, the purposeful firms, they're overly focused on being as big as possible. The purposeful firm just looks at the world and says, I'm doing all this good stuff. I want to be doing more of it. So even at the competitive ideal, the purposeful firm would still like to be bigger. If it could figure out a way to be bigger than its competitors, it would still like to seize that chance, even though that would be bad socially. And this is part of what we show in the paper, that although that's what the ESG firm would like, it just can't work out a way to get there. At this point, if it were to adopt even more aggressive ESG policies, then the anti-competitive effect would kick in and it would make itself smaller after all. So the pressure to compete up stops exactly when firms hit the competitive ideal of competitive wages and prices. There's no incentive for them to move further than that. Why not? Because again, if they were to move any further than that, and this is part of what we show in the paper, if they were to adopt more aggressive ESG policies than that, then the policies would backfire. It would make the adopting firm smaller. And again, this is a world in which the adopting firm wants to be as big as possible. Okay, so this is, I've tried to give a short summary of our journey in this paper. I have to say, relative to, I feel this is one of the papers that, at least in writing it, I learned the most, right? I started not really sort of understanding how much of this would play out, and working through this was very informative to me, and I hope very informative to people who see or read this paper. So I have a conclusion slide, which is really just a summary slide. So just to remind you, what have we done in this paper? we've tried to work through the implications of firms promising to treat stakeholders better than market conditions alone dictate, and the things that, if you had to like boil this down to 3 things to remember, it's the moderate policies, moderate ESG pledges are pro-competitive, aggressive ESG policies are anti-competitive, and in general, you should expect to see when firms are sort of choosing ESG policies consciously or with a plan in mind, regardless of whether they are shareholder-focused or more broadly stakeholder-focused, you should expect to see firms pick relatively moderate pledges for which the pro-competitive effects are the dominant ones and relatively benign outcome as a result. Okay, so many thanks.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. I must admit I haven't read the paper. One question I had, when you're talking about pro-competitive, anti-competitive, are these predictions depending on whether the nature of imperfect competition is of strategic substitutability or strategic complementarity or not?
No, so very good and very perceptive. So in the back, so I've given you sort of the purely verbal version of this paper, but as Matthias is correctly spotting, in the background there is there was obviously a model of imperfect competition. The model we're using here is just an off-the-shelf Cournot model of competition. And in particular, we're adopting the standard Cournot assumption that the firm's output decisions in the Cournot world are strategic substitutes. So as one firm produces more, its competitor produces less. And that is certainly important for at least some, not all the results, there are some results which we'll go through, but certainly for some subset of results, that is an important assumption.
For the result that moderate ESG policies are pro-competitive, because in a sense, strategic substitutability means that if I'm tougher to my competitor, yes, the competitor reacts by being softer.
Yes.
So would that be turned around if we move to a Bertrand type thing?
So certainly the result that by committing to compete tougher, my competitor retreats is going to be turned around by strategic complementarity. The result that the firm will benefit, I believe, is still there, because in the end, this is just I'm committing to. I have sort of the non-commitment outcome, and anything which is going to shift me away from that on the margin is potentially going to be valuable. So the idea that the ESG policy can increase profits, I believe, will still be there, but the way it's going to increase profits is going to be different in that case.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very enlightening. It's interesting how you compare these pro-competitive and anti-competitive ESG policies. And more than in the past, of course, we can already read some public ESG policies. Yep. My impression is that they are so ambitious. So there is so much content there to achieve, and I always think that by working in a company, we need to be careful on what we publish, because we risk being trying to reach more than we could, yes, from a company perspective, and the risk of greenwashing is very high on those companies. So your impression is that at the moment the market is on a pro-competitive or an anti-competitive stage based on the ESG policies?
I guess it's two halves to that. Well, I guess there's multiple things I should say to this. So first I would say that I guess my own impression of company policies is that there are many words, but the actual promises are relatively weak. So obviously this is subject to much interpretation, but I guess my starting interpretation is rather different from yours, and I would tend to read firms' policies as relatively weak promises. Slightly separately, I do think at this moment, or maybe the moment has now peaked, but I think until recently, at least in the US, we've been in the up phase of an ESG cycle in which firms have been committing to outdo their competitors' ESG policies. So it's not the same. So that is still the case. So the up phase of the cycle always, at least within our analysis, always lives in the pro-competitive region. So the firms are still adopting ESG policies with the intent of increasing their profits, and that only works if they're in the pro-competitive region. So I guess in terms of your question, I would both say that I think firms' policies are pro-competitive, but they're pro-competitive because they're relatively mild, even though they are at the same time, until recently at least, increasing over time.
Thank you very much for having studied this topic. It is very important and timely that you have published this paper, and congrats for the prize. I haven't had the chance yet to complete reading the paper, and perhaps my question is covered there. But you said on your presentation that purpose firms have no incentive to abandon ESG until reach competitive level. Yeah. Does it mean that once they reach competitive level, they abandon ESG policies?
Sorry, say the last part of your question again.
Yeah,
once they reach the competitive level?
Yeah, you said on your presentation, one of the last slides, that purpose firms, they have no incentive to abandon ESG until reach competitive level.
Yes.
And does it mean that once they reach competitive level, they abandon ESG policies?
Oh, no. I thank you for asking me to be more precise here. No, what this means is that the competing purposeful or sort of stakeholder-focused firms offer more and more generous ESG policies until let me again say this in the worker case, and so. In the paper, we often collapse everything to stand to a monetary equivalent. So imagine the competitive sort of non-monopoly distorted wage rate with 30 euros an hour. So what this would be is that firms compete in their ESG policies until they reach 30 euros an hour, and then they stop. So we look at the world, and this will be, the firms will be saying, we're promising to treat our workers well. And the promise is, again, we're going to sort of collapse everything to monetary equivalence. The promise is we're going to promise to treat them 30 euros an hour well. And given that promise, the market outcome then turns out to be that all firms pay their workers 30 euros an hour. And so we match what would be the competitive outcome. But we're only at the competitive outcome because the firm's promises are still there. If the firms would actually abandon the ESG promise, then the outcome would be something very different. Okay? So it's going to be another case in which we'll look at the world, and if we're not careful, we'll think firms are making these promises and not doing anything. But that would be wrong. There would be a case where we're only at in this case, the relatively benign outcome because the firms are making their ESG promises. Okay, so I hope that clarified that.
Okay, last question.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. I would have two questions, very quick. The first is if we can expect that companies will be more, will advance moderate ESG policies. Do you think that maybe we can expect also that some of them will go over the breaking point and become purpose of corporations like you define them? So even changing their nature, or just doing simple, moderate ESG policies? And the second question is more from a legal perspective, is like, what do you think could the regulator roles be? Like, could it speed up the enaction of moderate ESG policies, or maybe there is a risk that they set up the bar in a too aggressive way so that they reach the anti-competitive and so negative consequence because of too aggressive ESG regulations? Thanks.
Okay, great. So many thanks. So on the first one, one of the things we've tried to do in this paper is conceptually distinguish between the firm's objective, whether it's maximizing, just say, shareholder profits, or whether it's trying to maximize some broader social objective, from the policy, the means that it's using to try to do this, which in our world is the ESG policy. So at least within our framework, we're not going to have what you asked about, so you asked about, if I adopt a sufficiently aggressive ESG policy, do I switch objective? And that's, at least in our conceptual framework, that's not something which is going to happen, because again, we've sort of distinguished between the firm's objectives and the policy used to get there. On the regulation question, let me tell you the aspect of this which we've thought most concretely about, because I think that will be most useful. So that think about the shareholder focus, the profit maximizing focused firms when they compete in ESG. So something I didn't emphasize perhaps as much as I should is that competition in ESG policies, so it's pushing the ESG policies in a more aggressive direction. Each upwards deviation in ESG policy benefits the adopting firm, but it hurts the competitor. But perhaps more importantly, it typically decreases combined profits. So it helps the adopting firm, hurts the competitor, but it also decreases industry profits. And what that means is that if firms could agree to collude on the ESG policies, they would agree to collude on a no ESG policy at all. Now, colluding on no ESG at all is actually going to be relatively hard in our world, because there is this benefit from deviating upwards. So it might be too hard for the firms to agree to collude on no ESG policy at all, but maybe they would like to agree, but maybe they could agree to collude on, say, moderate ESG, because for moderate ESG, there's still going to be some benefit from deviating upwards, but perhaps not so much benefit either. And because of that, one thing that we mentioned briefly in the paper, and which we generally worry about, is that, say, industry standards, which might look like relatively benign things, like well, all firms say we're going to do this much ESG, should be understood not as a benign outcome, but in fact as firm collusion on saying this is a moderate ESG policy that we can all agree to keep without going more aggressive, even though from a social perspective, it would be better if firms competed themselves out of that moderate ESG policy. So again, I think there's much more to say here, but what I've just told you is the thing that we at least have given most thought to so far.
Great. Thank you very much, Philip. I think the editors have chosen well. I think this is, of course, a very, very topical paper, and we invite you all to read it, or at least to write the summary of the paper. I guess, George, is that going to be you? Or maybe it's going to be the LLM, as Daniela said this morning, or a combination of the two.
I should say I've tried to get LLM to write a summary of this paper, and I was not happy with the outcome. So
okay, good. So thank you again, Philip, and congratulations.